everyone, all 130 of you. Hopefully we're going to get more. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Keith Wojcieszek. I am the global head of threat intelligence for Kroll. I'm based in DC and been with Kroll for over about 7 years now. Prior to this, I worked with the U.S. Secret Service, where I had the pleasure and opportunity to work with and lead the U.S. Secret Service's Cyber Threat Intelligence Program. Today is August 21st, which means that school is just about here. Anyone with kids, anyone going to college, they're off, they're learning more, and going to lead our industry here soon. So my wife is a teacher, and she went back to school this week. And Laurie George is funny. So I go downstairs today to help her get ready, because that's the kind of guy I am. And she said to me, Keith, have you seen the dog bowl? I said, no. I said, I didn't know he could. Anyway, I am delighted to be able to speak to with all of you today. At Kroll, we're always looking to provide thoughtful insight and great value to our clients, help them defend their organization against the latest cyber threats, and improve their cyber maturity, of course. But before we get started, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's session will be recorded and will be available after the briefing. We are using GoToWebinar for the presentation. You'll find the client on your monitor. Through that client, you'll be able to submit questions at any time. Laurie, George, myself will address the questions at the end. And if there's something in the middle of it that's vital, we will address that as well. So a little background. So Kroll carried out about thousands of engagements in 2023 and continuing that pace here in 2024. Today, we'll be taking a look at current trends that our threat intelligence team has collected and highlighting during the second quarter, and highlighting specifically the second quarter of 2024. So we are in a very unique position to deliver end-to-end cybersecurity solutions across several different service lines. We have a wealth of experience with over 650 cybersecurity experts on the Kroll team who are working around the globe with companies of many sizes, varieties of industries, and we work with over 85 cyber insurance carriers. This gives us tremendous visibility in what's going on the front lines for sure. So in this session today, we're going to cover the cyber threat landscape with specific focus on quarter two. So in quarter two, we saw an increase in attacks against the education sector, which is being heavily targeted by ransomware, specifically the group FOG. We also saw an increased activity related to attacks surrounding the cloud. Unauthorized access incidents increased this quarter due to groups like Scattered Spider. They're attempting to gain access to the cloud networks. We also saw cloud used as an entry point for threat actors who are exploiting valid accounts. With that, Laurie and George will go into detail with that for sure. And we're very, very fortunate to have those two today leading the Kroll team and going into more detail to provide their expert analysis. So again, we're joined by Laurie Iacono and George Glass. Laurie, George, do you mind spending a few minutes introducing yourselves?
Sure, I'll start. So my name is Laurie. I'm an associate managing director for Kroll's Cyber Threat Intel team, and I focus on leading our North American CTI team, and we do a lot of support for our digital forensics and incident response examiners, and a lot of that is looking across the cases to identify emerging threats and trends like we're going to be discussing today.
Hi everyone, I'm George, associate managing director in the CTI team. My team mostly focus on novel malware threats, new vulnerabilities, and looking for ways to detect threat actor activity.
Yeah, and George and Laurie are pioneers in the industry. They're always getting something new, exciting, and be able to protect our clients. Number one, we want to fight these bad guys. Now, with that, Laurie's going to go into a lot. We're getting a lot of numbers today, Laurie, right? And I think the best thing to do is understand how we collect it, background, and how we get the data, and how we process and provide analysis. So Laurie, I'm going to turn it to you.
Yeah, no, and that's a good question because we're going to see a lot of graphs in today's session. So I want to talk a little bit about where those numbers are coming from. And as I mentioned before, most of this is derived from our D4 cases. So this is an instance where Kroll has been engaged in some capacity. There is some kind of incident for an organization, either they're either calling us in to validate or triage what may be suspicious activity, or there is a full-blown cyber attack such as ransomware encryption, and they're calling us to come in and to respond to that. Now what we do is we look at that data on a monthly basis. We also look at it on a quarterly basis, which is what we're going to be going over today. And it is really a view of what we're seeing, right? So it's people who have called Kroll and engaged us, but we try to overlay that with what we're seeing in the broader industry. So we're also comparing our data against OSINT and other security research reporting. We're also comparing it with, what we're seeing on the dark web that threat actors are talking about, and that's kind of how we develop the quarterly session every time, and build out the themes that we'll be talking about a little bit more at length today. So if let's get into some of the numbers here. We're going to start out looking specifically at sector, and I know we're going to get to the education sector, but first we're going to look at a broad, kind of like the broad spectrum of what we were seeing with sector targeting in the second quarter of this year. And no surprise, professional services was again the top firm that we were seeing in our cases here at Kroll. And professional services, that encompasses a lot of different entities. This could be law firms, accounting firms, business services firms. We also continue to see manufacturing coming in at second of the targeted industries, and financial services is also on that list. We did have a jump this particular quarter in healthcare, so it went up from about it went up by about 5 percentage points from Q1. And looking in those healthcare cases, a lot of what we're seeing impacting them was email compromise, as well as ransomware, particularly by the Lockbit group, Inc. ransomware, and we also did see some relation to the healthcare sector and fog ransomware, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in this particular section. So, we specifically called out education though, so I want to look a little bit more at education and some of the trends that we see with that sector, because even though it didn't make our top 5 for this time, we did observe an increase from the last quarter. And it's interesting to note that we tend to see these seasonal increases associated with education sector. So you can see in 2023 we saw an increase in activity around Q2 and Q3. Then we see a little less usually in like Q4, Q1, and then typically if our predictions are right for this year, we're going to see another spike in activity in Q3. And based on some of the cases that we've had incoming, I think that is likely. And it's likely that this kind of seasonal ebb and flow is definitely related to the fact that threat actors may be, looking at education as more of an attractive sector in the summer months, those times when there is a lot of transition, right? End of school, back to school, because they may be expecting, first of all, they may be more likely to pay some kind of a ransom during those peak times because they need access to services. And it could also be a belief that there's a perceived reduction in IT staffing during those summer months, so some kind of infection might go unnoticed and allow that to be a more impactful event. So let's look specifically at the next slide. We're going to look at some of the threat incident types that are targeting the education sector. And obviously we started out and we're going to be talking about fog ransomware today. So we saw actually, number 1 for education sector was email compromise, followed by ransomware. And I kind of want to compare that to what we were seeing across all sectors, right? So the numbers on the left here are just the education sector. And then if we look over at the numbers on the right of this slide, this is all sectors. So, when we compare the education sector to all sectors, you can see that ransomware is a little higher than average. Like on average, we have about 18% of ransomware across sectors, and we see about 29% incident with education clients. Same thing with unauthorized access. That one is also a little elevated compared to the all sectors look. And malware is a really interesting one here, because malware in general across all sectors, it doesn't even really, it's very low on our percentages across all sectors. But if we look just at the education sector, it actually counts for 7% of what we see. So those might be cases, and we're going to get really into this later in George's section, but those are usually cases where, it's some kind of malware on the network, but it hasn't progressed to, maybe like a full-blown ransomware incident where we have evidence of encryption and exfiltration. So Let's look at our next slide here, and we're going to get into so how are actors getting into education organizations. And then in Q2, the most common way that we were seeing was actually, according to the numbers, it comes out as CVE exploitation. And a lot of this 38% here was related to the Pan OS CVE, which we're going to talk about later in the presentation. And most of those were what we would call, I think we would classify those as kind of level 0 or level 1s, where there was some kind of access, but we didn't actually see the access progress to something worse or some kind of an incident on the system. So it was kind of stopped before it progressed anything. So that was what we were seeing. So that's why that number is a little higher than normal. But I want to look over here on the right side of the graph. If we look at drive-by, external remote services, and valid accounts, each of those on their own account for about 13%, but when you add those three up, it accounts to 39%. So it's actually higher than CVE. And why that is important is what we're going to cover in the next section here. Because one of the things that's driving valid accounts, and one of the things that people get infected with the drive-by compromise is something we call information stealing malware. And that is a problem that we see across all sectors, but we're particularly seeing a lot of it with the education sector. And those credentials that are stolen through that, they can be used to help with basically all three of those initial access methods. So George, can you kind of walk us through a little bit with what you've been seeing? I know your team's been following some actually new stealers that we've seen in the last quarter. So can you start walking us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. Information stealers, they've been around for a long time, but in terms of their capability to be bought and sold, it's a very commoditized market now. There's ways that lower skilled threat actors can quickly get access to credentials and tokens and sell those on the deep and dark web, on underground forums. So today we're going to explicitly look at some example infection chains, looking at Clearfake, IDAT loader, and redline stealer. So this is basically the story of how a redline stealer, information stealing malware, may end up on a corporate or even a personal device, and we'll get into that in just a second. So let's kick off here and take a look at how Clearfake is typically used by these groups. Clearfake is an in-browser JavaScript framework. It's something that can be deployed onto maybe a malicious ad. It can be set up on a specific website designed to attract attention. Typically, we see these things offering fake or cracked software, something that may be of particular interest to, maybe gamers, maybe people that are interested in cryptocurrencies. But, just as we saw with malwares like SockGhoulish, specifically programs that are designed to be downloaded by system administrators, people like that, people that have highly privileged accounts within an environment. And essentially, it presents itself as a fake update. So looking at how the social engineering is being conducted here is really interesting. And we still see this malware up until literally this week. It's not something that is part of just the last couple of quarters. This is a prolific threat. So if we look at the next slide here, we can see that the newest version of Clearfake, and we've got a blog on this, and there's been a lot of reporting on this particular method in open source as well. In this case, there's not even like a fancy download, some kind of crazy execution chain here. It's literally just social engineering to get a user to open up PowerShell and paste in a malicious command. That's all this is doing. And you may think, well, surely users should be trained for this. There's all these sorts of security training. And yes, you're absolutely right. But I can tell you right now that lots of people do fall for this. And this is a really hard thing for most organizations to detect, right? Someone just opening up PowerShell and typing something in. There's not a lot of contextual activity there to piece stuff together. What we see is the next part of this infection chain could be something like IDAT loader. IDAT loader is a relatively new threat since maybe September 2023. It's again very opportunistic in its targeting. We see it affecting all sectors. It can be distributed by other pieces of malware, phishing, drive-by download, as we've discussed with ClearFake. And again, we're seeing this all the time. One of the most interesting things about IDAT Loader, and we've just released another blog post on this as well, is that it focuses very heavily on low detectability. It will use things like MSHDA and PowerShell for sort of the initial loading. And then one of the more interesting things that we've discovered recently, and you can read the blog on this, so I won't get too nerdy, on BPL side loading or Boolean package library side loading, but that essentially operates very similar to DLL side loading. Essentially, IDAT Loader is designed to be heavily obfuscated, and it's designed to evade detection. Then what we see, it could be IDAT Loader, could be some other sort of loader, is the deployment of some kind of information stealing malware. In this case, the example here is Redline Stealer. There's been a pretty large campaign over the last few months, specifically targeting ClearFake, IDAT Loader, and Redline Stealer. Again, Redline Stealer it's freely available on the underground. It's basically a subscription service, and it's designed to collect data from installed browsers. It can download browsing history, and then most importantly, things like session tokens and cookies, VPN credentials, for those that may want to specifically target people that are in the crypto industry, crypto wallets, other things like chat messages that could reveal, tokens, API keys, so on and so forth, and then other things as well. One of the examples here is FileZilla. All of the credential stealers that we're going to talk about are very, very often they're designed to be able to very easily iterate upon things. So if one information stealer increases its capability, the rest tend to follow suit. So, one may be very similar to the other. Information stealers tend to run in memory as well, but Redline Stealer is, maybe a little bit different from others. It can actually drop additional malware as well. So if an interesting, web token or cookie or set of credentials is found on a particular system, a threat actor can quickly pivot to deploying, post-exploitation frameworks. And if we look at the next slide, that's really reflected on numbers that we collected for Q2. Pretty much everything Stealer related has shot right up our rankings. We've got some loaders in there, SteelC, Redline Stealer, Formbook, Amadei. All of those things have information stealing capabilities, and they're alongside other sort of post-exploitation frameworks like Cobalt Strike, Metasploit, and Sliver. And so you can really get a good understanding that threat actors may use these credentials for just essentially walking through the front door through VPNs, external remote services, or they may choose to pivot to things like Cobalt Strike and Metasploit to conduct ransomware operations. And Laurie, I know that you and your team have been looking at fog ransomware, so I'll hand back to you to take us through that.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. I do want to address a couple of questions that came in the chat though. One was about email compromise and what kind of like how we define that. So when we have email compromise listed as a threat incident type, that's usually some case where, there has been unauthorized access to the email tenant, usually the M365 account, and there's evidence that the actors are doing something in the system, either viewing emails or creating roles. A lot of this is related to business email compromise, so kind of looking on the fraud perspective of things, but we would capture in that if a phishing email was maybe received and it hadn't been actioned or clicked upon, that might also fall into that email compromise. umbrella. And then another one, George, I don't know, this one came in about the Infostealer, talking about like, you know, either Windows or Mac OS threats. What are you seeing with regards to that?
Yes, most of the things that are listed on that top 10 are Windows-based stealers, because that's the majority of the environments that we tend to monitor, and so that's the thing that we detect the most. But that does not mean to say that there are not Mac OS stealers there. I think one of them is probably Atomic Stealer from the top of my head. So yes, certainly, you know, when these malwares are targeting things like browsers and so on and so forth, realistically, at the end of the day, they just need to access the information in the browser, take those databases, zip them up and send them out. There's different methods of detection, different safeguards in place in different systems. But, you know, if you were going to target, let's say, engineers and engineering laptops, then probably you want to start targeting Mac OS and Linux as well. So although most of these are Windows-based threats, there are certainly Mac OS and Linux information stealers out there as well.
Yeah, and I think a third question just came in about Redline Stealer targeting Chrome passwords. And, you know, as George mentioned, a lot of times that is exactly what we're seeing. It's, you know, taking advantage of people who aren't, you know, keeping their browsers up to date maybe, and they're all storing, you know, those passwords in a Chrome extension, because we see on a lot of the marketplaces even, I mean, that's a lot of what it is those Chrome saved passwords. So
sorry, like, could I just add an additional point there? So sorry, but it's a really good point to make that, you know, Chrome save sessions. You may log in on your work device on your Chrome account or your Google account. You may sync that to your home account with all of your passwords there. So for a corporate environment, if a user on their personal device and has that sync capability downloads an information stealer, those are corporate credentials that they're accessing, and you probably have very little visibility of that activity going on. So it's a really good point, a really, really good question.
Yeah, so we're going to get into, you know, back to our regularly scheduled programming, so to speak. We're going to talk a little bit more about Fog ransomware. And as I said, this one was one that it's first been kind of publicly observed in May 2024. And what we were seeing, at least with our Kroll cases, was it targeting higher education institutions. So we saw a lot of colleges, universities, technical colleges being targeted by this particular ransomware. And, you know, the TTPs that we were seeing, you know, it's kind of directly related to what George just talked about with the Infostealers, because what it seems like this group is mostly doing was coming in via some kind of compromised credentials. And those could be ones that, you know, could be found maybe readily available on the dark web, but it's more likely that they're coming from those information stealing malware. Because, you know, based on our knowledge of the ransomware ecosystem, it seems like those logs for sale for the Infostealers, they usually go to sale first to the ransomware groups before they actually make their way onto the marketplaces. So they're definitely mining those for access into systems. As far as, you know, the tactics and what we were seeing with respects to a Fog ransomware case, some of the things that we saw them doing once they were in the system was using brute force to escalate privileges. We saw them creating accounts to maintain persistence. Some of the tools that we saw them using were advanced port scanner, and then we also saw them using several different third-party services for exfiltration, because exfiltration was a part of these particular attacks. I'm gonna flip over to the next slide. I don't want to talk about ransomware variants, but I'll keep talking a little bit about Fog. But one of the things, you know, one of the questions that we were asked when we first started seeing this spike in activity with Fog was because we were seeing less cases related to Akira, we were seeing more cases related to Fog, and there was the natural question, like, is this maybe a rebrand? But no, that doesn't seem to be the case, and we actually see Akira being very active in this quarter. There's some active campaigns going on with that group. So Fog does seem to be a separate gang. Based on our review of cases, we identified several distinct actors that were likely involved in these FOG ransomware cases that we observed. So it's very likely that it is an affiliate model that they're using. We did see some overlap in the FOG cases with using the same tools that we have seen affiliates use with Akira. So there may be some affiliates that are kind of double dipping, so to speak, but it is likely two separate entities. And one thing interesting with FOG is that we're not seeing them like some of the ransomware as a service groups kind of advertise and recruit very publicly on the forums. But as of now, we're not seeing that by the FOG ransomware group. So it may be more of a closed affiliate model there. And there was a lot of activity with ransomware in Q2 that we kind of haven't mentioned with relates to law enforcement disruption. There was like a second layer of seizures and disruption to Lockbit. They actually named the individual. They indicted the individual that is believed to be behind the Lockbit SUP moniker. But unfortunately, that particular site is still posting victims as of now. There was also a lot of disruption. There was something called Operation Endgame that kind of disrupted that info stealing malware ecosphere. But again, we still see actors using that for access. So let's go on to our next section of the presentation. We're going to specifically talk about initial access. And looking across all of our cases here for initial access, we did see phishing remain the top initial access method that was observed. A lot of that is related to, earlier I talked about email compromise. We do see a lot of email compromise cases at Kroll, and a lot of that phishing as the vector is related to those cases. They'll kind of send, some kind of phishing email purporting to be a document sharing or, some other known account that the user uses. They'll put in their credentials and they'll use that to pivot into the network. We also saw a big jump in CVE, which we'll talk a little bit about next, but most of that was related to PAN-OS. And then as you can see, valid accounts, which we've talked about with the Infostealers, and we'll talk about a little later with cloud services, it's been pretty consistent across quarters. So it's not the sexiest or the most sensational of initial access methods, but it's a tried and true, very popular method for threat actors. So, as I mentioned, the CVE exploitation that we were seeing in the second quarter was mostly related to a specific CVE for Palo Alto networks. George, can you tell us a little bit about that one on our next slide?
Yeah, the PAN-OS Global Protect Zero Day. I think we started referring to it internally as a pandemonium. It's pretty much the worst of the worst in terms of vulnerability. It's a CVSS score of 10, and it essentially enables a unauthenticated threat actor to execute arbitrary code on the device. The initial exploitation was discovered in the wild on March 26th. That activity was associated with an advanced persistent threat group that was deploying the up style backdoor, which essentially receives commands and outputs them into a CSS file that the threat actor could then go and view the outputs of those commands. Essentially, they could dump the credentials if they needed to, and then as a follow-on that activity, they're using, again, valid accounts for internal pivoting within a network. However, a few days later, it was revealed just how simple this vulnerability was to exploit. The traversal and the command injection in the session ID handle, which you can see there, essentially that endpoint would have a Python script attached to that on a cron job. In this case, every hour, it would execute that command. So all a threat actor really had to do is put a command on their command and control domain, and every hour that command would run. And so it didn't take long for the rest of the cybercrime sort of ecosphere, underground, things like that, to get on this and start abusing it. With a POC posted on or around sort of April 16th. Following that, we started to see Lockbit and Akira cases I think one of the things really to draw attention to here as well is the popularity of these devices. Just in the States there, look, 17,000 devices directly attached to the internet. That's a huge attack surface. And although it was initially used for what was sort of speculated as espionage activity, for a ransomware actor, it really doesn't get much better than this. It's literally walking in through the front door. So yeah, I think this makes up for quite a lot of those statistics that Laurie was mentioning, and allowed a lot of internal pivoting, and of course led to ransomware and encryption for impact and data exfiltration. This is the first time this is going to happen. It's not the last time it's going to happen. So I think it's really important that organizations are prepared to deal with something quite like this. Yeah. I think that the next slide here, we're going to go on to talk about cloud services and more of a SaaS style of sort of operating. And I'll take a couple of these and then I'll hand back to Laurie to take a few more. But sort of on the trend of exploiting vulnerabilities and absolutely information stealing malware, I think it would be remiss of us if we didn't mention the Snowflake attacks that were happening in Q2. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that the majority of those intrusions were based on information that had been stolen from information stealing malware, that essentially threat actors just figured out that this was a very viable attack path, and they could use that to attack Snowflake instances and take very valuable information and lots of it very quickly. Additionally, we sort of see on the sort of a similar trend of using valid accounts. I think even in the news recently, there's a news of a campaign that's using environment variables, .env variables in projects uploaded to GitHub, other code sharing repositories and things like that may have not been sanitized properly. Those .env variables, when accessing a cloud service, things like API keys, tokens, secret access keys, those sorts of things, essentially, again, allow a threat actor to walk straight in using those credentials and then perform whatever they need to on that cloud environment, whatever that may be. And I think that's a really important thing to take away here. But Laurie, I'll hand back to you for more the social engineering aspect and some of the things that we're seeing with Scattered Spider and the COM.
Yeah, so I want to pivot off of what you were talking about with Snowflake was the threat actors. A lot of that when Snowflake breach started, there was a lot of speculation that it was actual company Snowflake had been breached, right? And later review found out that wasn't actually the case, that this was related to those threat actors kind of mining the underground markets, looking for those companies that had the Snowflake part of the domain so they could get those credentials. And it kind of tracks back to our earlier, the name of our session is like threat actors do their homework, right? So it kind of illustrates how threat actors mine those marketplaces, right? They're specifically looking for specific types of creds. So that was a really good, a good illustration of how they are doing their homework, going after those Snowflake creds. Another, illustration of that is some of the social engineering that we are seeing threat actors do. I know Scattered Spider, the group that we follow as KTA243, they are really known for socially engineering their victims. And we had a case this quarter where the social engineering was calling the help desk, right? So they were basically calling the help desk to try to get these password resets. But if you call your help desk, there's sometimes a lot of authentication that you have to go through and questions that you have to answer to be able to do that. And I think the frightening part of that, unfortunately for these cases, was that they had the answers. So again, they were doing their homework on their victims. They knew, to start with, they knew who they were going to ask the password for the initial access. And then actually once they got into the system, they started finding other persons of interest within the company who could get them greater access, and then they would call back the help desk. And I think they did this about 4 or 5 times while they had access to the network to try to get access into new accounts. So doing their homework outside of the network, and also doing their homework inside the network to help them increase their access. So, you know, another thing interesting with, we had this case, I said, related, you know, likely related to Scattered Spider, the COM. And, you know, fortunately for our client here, they actually identified the activity and ejected the actors before it advanced to something like exfiltration. But unfortunately, they did have a lot of access during their time in the system, which was about less than 10 hours. But during that period of time when they were in there, they were able to, as I said, I think, you know, they socially engineered the help desk about 5 different times to increase, you know, access. They were also creating new user accounts. And they even went so far as to create a new user and then create a new email address for that user. And a lot of what they were doing at that point, like I said, they weren't at the like exfiltration actions on objectives phase, but they were kind of in that initial probing phase. And a lot of what we observed them doing was probing those cloud applications, SaaS applications. I think our final count was about 8 of them that the actors either had some kind of access to, or, you know, tried to probe while they had that access into the network. So it just kind of, you know, highlights again the threat actor entrance in these kind of services. And, you know, the valid accounts is kind of the thread that ties all of these together. And then George, I know you mentioned this morning about the .env variables. So can you talk a little bit about that one?
Yeah, so the .env variables, you know, that's really where people are uploading things to GitHub. They're not sanitizing their uploads and things like that. Again, I think it's probably going to become part of the information stealing malware to check those things, understand what's there, and get them out. I think one of the most important things there is really the element of least privilege. And you know, if let's just say AWS API token, secret access keys are in those environment variables, that is, you know, route 1 for threat actors to get into a cloud environment and restart doing whatever they want in there, pivoting and so on. So again, that really just comes down to sort of good practice, good hygiene, and understanding the privilege that those environment variables and those API keys and tokens have.
Yeah, so we want to talk next a little bit about, you know, how can we defend, or how can, you know, organizations detect this activity or potentially mitigate it before it starts. So George, can you talk a little bit about the detection side of things here?
Yeah, as it comes to valid accounts, it really does come down to the user space, where people are logging in from, how they're logging in. So being able to detect, you know, impossible travel has been a thing for a long time, but threat actors understand this. They will deliberately VPN to be close to their target because, again, if they've used an information stealing malware, they know exactly where that person is. They know exactly where they stole those credentials from, you know, just based on where the malware is infecting and the information they've stolen from the machine. So if they need to, they can VPN to be close to where that person is located, basically bypassing that detection. So there's a lot to be said here for you know, understanding how things like browser session hijacking using those stolen tokens, you know, detecting a new multi-factor device being registered, for example, understanding typical user patterns and logins, you know, out of office hours, weird times, multiple logins very quickly. All of those things lead into being able to detect this activity. It's not easy. This is one of the hardest things to get a good pattern of life and detect on. But again, you know, if you go to the MITRE ATT&CK pages for these, there's a lot of really good examples there for sort of defense in depth. And then in terms of mitigation, I think there's a few here that I'll take, and then I'll pass back over to Laurie. Some of the things here are quite pertinent to stuff that's been in the news, specifically Active Directory configuration. There's a lot to be said about how your AD tree is configured, what threat actors can use to understand what your environment looks like, what access to highly privileged groups are there. Recently, there's been news of a vulnerability whereby threat actors were able to elevate privileges to access ESXi administrative portals. That technique, adding or adding users or adding the group ESX admins, has been around for a while. It's been in the old Conti playbooks for a very, very long time, and it just goes to show threat actors know what these highly privileged accounts and groups are, and so they should be protected as such. Raise an alert if someone's added to that group, especially if it's out of hours and things like that. Account use policies as well. What sort of accounts can be used when, where, and how? Very, very important. And then the last thing I'll touch on, and then I'll hand over to Laurie, is multi-factor authentication. We've talked a lot about this, especially sort of actor in the middle phishing pages that can bypass multi-factor authentication. I think there's a lot to be said nowadays for hardware authentication, like physical security keys that must be plugged into a device in order to authenticate against it and things like that. Those sorts of methodologies are very, very hard to bypass. Not impossible, but it adds frustration to the threat actor. So yeah, maybe something to think about there. But Laurie, I'll hand over to you for some of those last mitigations.
Yeah, so I'll go into multi-factor authentication, and you already kind of touched on that. It's one that we hammer home in these threat landscapes like over and over and over. And for many of you, you may be like, really, is this really still a problem? But we talked about Snowflake earlier, and a lot of the reason why the threat actors were able to leverage those creds was because they were able to, they did not have MFA applied, so they were able to get in. Also in the first quarter, probably one of the biggest cyber attacks of 2024 will always be Change Healthcare. And it came out in Q2 that one was also related to credentials that were found on the dark web. And again, this was an instance where there was no MFA, so the threat actors were able to leverage those credentials to get into the system. So one of those things that unfortunately we keep having to bring up time and time again, because we see it being such an effective it is very effective if it's in place, right? It only works if you have it. So, another thing that, we talk about a lot is like password hygiene. So this one here, looking at password policies, requiring complex, unique passwords across systems, rotating those frequently. With respects to privileged account management, it's kind of like everyone, it's like I said, it's kind of like a hygiene check, right? So, first of all, it's, looking for, making sure that you're keeping account of those privileged accounts, and do they actually need to be privileged? So kind of doing that routine assessment and inventory, and making sure that the accounts that you have labeled as privileged actually need that kind of access. There are some kind of environments, I know in Azure, you can actually configure alerts that let you know when a privileged account has gone many days without using that role, so that maybe you can decide whether or not to remove those accounts. So having something like that and following those alerts would be very important. With respects to general users, the same thing is applied. If users have access but they're not actually using the tool or the service, try to remove those, because having unnecessary users to a platform is just a risk for threat actors. And then finally, user training. So this really comes into account because we talked about multi-factor authentication, but unfortunately MFA can be bypassed, and one of the tactics that they'll use to do that is something we call MFA prompt bombing. So they'll send someone a barrage of alerts, maybe at a very inconvenient time, If the user gets enough of those, the annoyance factor alone may just cause them to click on one of those and approve one of those sessions. Unfortunately, if they do that, that can allow a threat actor in. So having your users be aware of what would look like suspicious MFA sign-in activity so that they can identify that and not click on those notifications goes a long way to help with keeping those threat actors out of cloud environments. And if we look on the last, I know we're coming up at time here. I know we have one more slide that's just kind of looking generally at actions that organizations can take. And, one of the things too is, we can have all the security controls in place, but one thing we should be doing is regularly testing them. So one of the, I just want to highlight, as I have on here, we have conduct annual cloud security risk assessments. And I think this is really important for organizations, put those controls in place, but also validate to make sure that they're actually working in your environment. And George, did you have anything to add before we move it over to Keith for the summary?
Yeah, I think I'll just tie back some of the comments here around AI and ML in cloud security monitoring. Going back to the pattern of life that you want to establish, that's really, really important, especially when it comes to cloud, because realistically, the keys to the cloud are just an API key. And so, yeah, understanding that pattern of life, what normal looks like, what abnormal doesn't, that's really, really key.
Awesome. And so, a lot of this stuff that Laurie and George talked about with the detect and defend stuff with the MITRE framework. Now, like I said, we say it all the time, and I've been doing this for about 20 years. We actually we're honored to have a silverback on the line here, Jim Meehan. Used to work with time and time ago, and even be I don't even know if computers were invented when he started investigations, but he can tell you the kind of the same thing, right? The same security protocols, the same things you need to do time and time again to make sure, because threat actors, yeah, they get more sophisticated, but it's still the same way to get in, right? So Jimmy, if you're on, and I know you are, I'm sure you agree with this as well, that, just kind of looking at from, the Stone Age to today, it really hasn't changed that much. So with that, let's do a quick summary. Kroll's continued to see the target of the professional services, increase in all kinds of healthcare and education. I think it kind of coexists with the start of the school year. I have no scientific backing, but we're seeing this continuously happen during the second and third quarter. Education is heavily targeted by fog ransomware. Laurie did a phenomenal job going through what fog is, with ClearFake, with George, and Infostealers. I'll tell you that they're everywhere, right? And it's really interesting to see, how impactful these Infostealers are. Phishing, I'm phishing, right? It's something that we're seeing all the time, and it's going to continue. It's not going to stop. Everyone here has multiple email accounts. It's sheer by numbers. It's this mass email, and that's how they get it. So that's always going to maintain. Cloud has been in the past, but it's still going to continue. I mean, think about it. How many access points do you have in a cloud environment? It can just spider off, and so threat actors know this. They're extremely sophisticated and smart, and so we're definitely going to see an increase with that. 0 days, I mean, that's hand in foot every day. So there's all things going on. So with this webinar today, it's been fantastic. I think there's been a ton of information provided. Again, this will be on video. You can go ahead and replay this over and over again. Listen to George and Laurie. They're so brilliant. And as well, and just to kind of little summary, another thing before I get into I think there's one question we want to answer, was on September 25th, if anyone's in the Pittsburgh area. Like I said, Laurie is such a pioneer in the industry, so well respected. A Women in Technology Conference, September 25th in Pittsburgh. I'm sure she has it on LinkedIn. If you have any questions on that, cti@kroll.com. Be more than happy to provide information. But I'm telling you, Laurie is the top of her game, and she's really setting the bar for others, and she's gonna be speaking at that conference. So with that, we have a few minutes to take a couple questions. Quick reminder, I know we had questions come in. Type your questions now for the team. We had a couple come in we addressed. I have one more that I thought was really interesting. And George, I'm gonna talk to you, and I think Laurie, you probably want to discuss this too. But what initial access method should they be most concerned about? There's so many. I don't know if it's more of a proprietary when it comes to the industry, but really like to get your perspective on that with you guys seeing this on day to day.
Yeah, I think one of the main things here is, we've spoken so much about valid credentials. That is by far and away the thing that threat actors want to get access to the most, because it just, it greases the wheels of their intrusion, right? They don't need to come up with any funky vulnerabilities or anything like that. And so I think for me, getting a good handle on that and using some of the things that we've suggested there would be my main thing that I worried about. But yeah, Laurie, I don't know if you had any other thoughts on that, any other sort of mitigative strategies, anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say probably the best answer is all of them. Kind of like looking at what we went over today with valid accounts, I think, external remote services is also a big one, because they can leverage those valid accounts with your, VPN or your external remote access. So I think those are really, two important ones to consider.
Awesome. Yeah, and it's funny because with that, it's you can try and the resource is tough too, because it's getting in, it's understanding where you fit into your budget. So you really got to understand kind of where your budget is, and go from there and have a priority list of where you're at. So I think that's a really good question. I just put in the chat. I put in, so every Monday the team goes together. We do a weekly briefing, and it deals with the hot topics of the week before and maybe that weekend. So Monday mornings, we do give a threat intel briefing. That's on YouTube. I put the channel in the chat. Please listen to it. There's some really good insight to that, and maybe help you understand kind of what the context is. We're always open for discussion. But sadly, today we've run out of time. A big thank you for everyone that's taken the time to tune in. We hope you found this session informative. We have published our Q2 threat landscape report on the website. As well, I believe that Hannah, who has been instrumental in making this happen, has put it in the chat. So if you go into more of that, you look at that, and you want to see the trends that we outlined today, please have a read of the report. Any questions, cti@kroll.com. We'd be more than happy to answer. If you do like this webinar, and even if you don't, we do ask that you do leave a comment, right? We're very big on your feedback, and that's how we gauge to the future of what we're going to put in these webinars. We try to do the landscape, but also understanding what's important to you. So if you could spare a few moments, we'd greatly appreciate if you could tell us your thoughts on this session, and that will help us prepare for future sessions. Once again, thank you for joining. Enjoy the rest of your day. We hope to see you again, maybe on a Monday, where there's more dad jokes, more intel, and just a lot of fun. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.